Hello, my name is Lucia and Meve. I will be the first speaker on the affirmation, strongly affirming the resolution, "This House regrets the rise of True Crime podcasts." Starting off with our weighing mechanism, we are weighing this round on net benefits. And going into our definitions, we are defining this House as the United States of America and True Crime podcasts as any podcast with true crime as the focus. Going straight into our first contention, which is paranoid. Now, research has shown that the rise in true crime is causing people to be inappropriately paranoid. With this rise in true crime, specifically podcasts, which are easily accessible to many, true crime is taking over the minds of many listeners. It's all they can think about, which is causing them stress and paranoia. And being overly stressed and being overly paranoid is not good for the body or for the mind. It can even kill you. And the impact of all of this is that it's taking over listeners' minds, they're paranoid, they're stressed, and the quality of life is decreasing because of this stress overload. Moving on to our second contention, which is romanticization. We have 3 subpoints for this. With our first subpoint A being romanticization in the media. Now, because of this overload in podcasts, true crime is becoming something strictly for entertainment instead of what it truly is, horrific crime. This produced version makes it seem less horrific, like it's just something people can listen to on their drive to work. And the impact of all of this is it's lowering the impact of horrific crime and almost normalizing it. Moving on to our subpoint B, killer fan bases. Now, there's a phenomenon where large groups of people are fans of certain murders, and the rise of true crime podcasts are perpetuating this problem. Let's imagine your family just died, and a group of girls are fans of the killer and defending him, calling him hot. You would feel outraged, disrespected, which leads me to the impact. And the impact of all of this is it's disrespectful to the families, and in general, again, almost normalizing this horrific crime. Moving on to our third and final subpoint for this contention, which is exploitation. Now, when these podcasts are made, there's rarely consent from the victim families. And an example of this is the Dahmer show on Netflix, which didn't get permission from any of these families, or some of these families, to share these stories. Although this is a show and not a podcast, the concept is the same. There are plenty of podcasts about Dahmer, and I'm sure they didn't get any consent from the victims' families either. And the impact of this is they're using someone's pain for entertainment. We're not letting families mourn in peace and turning murder into something almost nonchalant. And with this, I urge a strong vote in the affirmation. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Anna McGarry. I'll be the first speaker for the opposition on the resolution. We're first going to be going over the opposition's case before moving into our responses. Sorry. Before moving into the responses on our opponent's case. I have 2 minutes on the clock, and my time begins now. So moving right into our first contention is that true crime podcasts create positive impacts in our justice system. So we have 2 examples today, although there are many more. The first is of the podcast of Serial, in which the podcasters helped release a man, Adnan Syed, from 23 years in prison. Next, the Teacher's Pet podcast led to the conviction of a man for the murder of his wife 40 years after the crime was committed. So we can see that through these podcasts, there are real-world impacts. Our justice system is working better because of them. Our justice system is so flawed, and by having people helping, gathering evidence, rather than just the people that are in charge or those that have those jobs, we can see that the justice system is improving every day. Our second contention is about increased vigilance. So by listening to these podcasts, people will be able to know what's out there and what could happen to them. They'll be able to research the possible things that they could do if a crime is committed toward them, and therefore we are actively preventing crime from happening by promoting true crime podcasts. And finally, it's an accessible medium of entertainment and income. So there are 3 groups here, right? There are the podcasters, the people who listen to the podcast, and the platforms on which the podcasts are on. True crime is an incredibly popular form of media, of podcasts, so therefore we are benefiting the people who make the podcasts. The people that listen to them are being entertained, which makes them happier, and the streaming services on which they are provided are able to grow. It's a win-win-win situation. Moving on to the affirmations case, their first contention was about paranoia. We have 2 responses to this. 1, if you're paranoid about these podcasts, you can stop listening to them. You are not forced to listen to these podcasts. Next, a good amount of paranoia is beneficial because it helps people become more vigilant, which leads to less crime happening. Next, they talk about the romanticization. They have 3 points on this. 1, about the media and how true crime becomes entertainment rather than crime. That's not true. We're reporting on this crime, and reporting on the crime rather than silencing it is so important. Next, they talk about the fan bases. This is not unique, meaning that it happens in the same world with or without true crime podcasts. If people stop listening to them, the Jeffrey Dahmer show will still be put on Netflix. And finally, they talk about exploitation. It's the same thing. This happens in the world regardless. So for all those reasons, I urge a strong vote for the negation. Thank you.
My name is Maeve. I am the second speaker on the affirmation side, strongly supporting the resolution that this House regrets the rise of true crime podcasts. I'm going to start by responding to the opposition's case, and then I'm going to move on to their responses to our case. First, I would like to respond to the opposition's first contention about the impact on the justice system. It is true that crimes being solved is a good thing, yes, but overall the negative impacts of true crime greatly outweigh the positive ones. Yes, maybe a few crimes are solved, but in exchange for this, hundreds of victims, including innocent children, are being exploited, and thousands of listeners of these podcasts are becoming overly paranoid and stressed, and their quality of life is decreasing. The negative impacts of true crime podcasts greatly outweigh the positive ones. I would now like to respond to their second contention about increased vigilance. Saying that it is good to be paranoid is blatantly untrue. It is good to be careful, it is good to have a baseline amount of knowledge on how to keep yourself safe, but being exposed to graphic, detailed, horrific crimes is not necessary to achieve this baseline level of personal safety. You don't need to know the specific traumatizing details of how people are mutilated in order to keep yourself safe. That is not helping anybody. At the level of detail that most true crime podcasts reach, the outcome of listening is extreme paranoia and anxiety, not increased vigilance as the opposition claims. I would now like to respond to their third contention about how true crime podcasts are an accessible form of income. This is actually a really terrible thing. It should not be accessible for people to profit off of the pain and murders of other people. This is a terrible thing. The fact that it is easy and accepted in society to profit off of murder and pain and turn it into entertainment is horrific, and it is appalling that this is allowed to happen. It is in no way a pro that people can so easily create a career out of the exploitation of innocent people who have been murdered. I would now like to respond to their responses to our case. Their response to our first contention about paranoia was essentially the same thing that they stated in their second contention about increased vigilance. I've already refuted this, but I will just very quickly restate it. Being overly paranoid is not a good thing. True crime podcasts do not lead to increased vigilance. They lead to paranoia, they lead to stress, they lead to the decrease of the quality of life, and that is not a good thing. The opposition's response to our second contention about romanticization is essentially that romanticization of crime happened before true crime podcasts and would have continued to exist without the existence of true crime podcasts. While this may be true, true crime podcasts have a giant audience and make up much of the media around true crime. Podcasts are also extremely accessible, they're often free, they're very easy to find. Therefore, even if romanticization exists outside of podcasts, podcasts are making true crime more accessible, and they're greatly widening the audience for true crime, which is in turn increasing the amount of exploitation and romanticization that is actually taking place. The availability of podcasts is worsening the problem with romanticization around crime because of, again, how accessible they are and how easy they are to listen to. And with that, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation.
Hello everyone, my name is Max Mankita, and I will be the next speaker for the opposition. Starting off with my opponent's first argument about paranoia. They say that true crime is making you paranoid, but again, if it is, you can just stop. No one is forcing you to listen to this, and for the people who don't find it that it creates paranoia and anxiety, it is a form of entertainment that helps them keep safe. Moving on to their second argument about romanticization. They talk a lot about how these people, the serial killers and murderers, there's fan bases and people become to create sympathy for them. But most of the time, the sympathy is with the victims of the crime. Instead, people's families, most people, they feel sympathy for the horrible things that have gone through. And then when they learn that serial killers are more likely to target vulnerable populations, such as the homeless, they're more likely to take action to protect the people in our society who is more vulnerable to these crimes because they have increased sympathy from listening to this. They talk about the exploitation of these people's lives. But again, isn't that just reporting the news or being a historian? People are not being exploited when their stories are being told. Again, this is just the news, this is just history, this is just all the same things happening with that. Moving on to the opposition case, our opponents say that even though a few people may have gotten out of prison, that there's other more important things. But let's stop and think about it. Someone right now may be in prison, they're suffering, they're rotting away, but they are innocent. And that is a horrible, horrible thing for anyone to go through. There are potentially people on death row who have gotten off because of true crime, and murderers who are now going to be whisked away from society and remain in safety. The most important impact of this round is that more people are safer and that innocent people are getting out of jail and their families don't have to worry about them rotting away and spending the rest of their life locked up. It is more important than some people being paranoid from, again, something they can stop doing. We go to our second contention and we get this increased knowledge versus paranoia debate happening again. And again, let me reiterate, no one is forcing you to listen to true crime. If it makes you paranoid, if it makes you scared, much like a horror movie, just turn it off. You don't need to listen to it. But for the people who do, that increased knowledge could potentially be life-saving. And then finally, on to our third argument. Again, we get this topic of exploitation. And are these podcasters exploiting the people? No, they're telling the news. They're historians. They're journalists. And now they have an opportunity to easily make enough money to make sure they can provide for provide enough food for their families. For all these reasons, I urge a strong vote for the opposition. Thank you.
My name is I'll be the final speaker on the opposition on this resolution. For my final speech, I'm just going to be going over the impacts on both sides. I have 1 minute. My time begins now. Let's talk about the affirmation cases, people that they affect. So their first contention affects just the average true crime listener. They get a little bit more stress in their daily lives, and we've already proven that they can just stop listening. Their second group of people is a very niche group that is possibly impacted by these true crime podcasters who might not ask them before they publish their podcast. But as we've already stated, it is better for these crimes to be reported on in the first place than to go under without being reported on at all. Now let's look at the opposition's case impacts. We can see people both potentially and actively being prevented from being murdered, from being convicted wrongfully for their crimes. People have increased vigilance, which means that they are walking around the street with knowledge of what can happen to them, which is actively preventing them from being the subject of the next true crime podcast. We can also see that people like Adnan Saeed, people like who are wrongfully imprisoned, are being released because of true crime podcasts, and that outweighs every single impact that the affirmation has. Our justice system working better is the most important part of this round, and that is what you should be voting on today. So for all those reasons, I urge a strong vote for the negation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lucia and Cerrito. I was the first and will be the last speaker on the affirmation strongly affirming the resolution that this House regrets the rise in true crime podcasts. So I have one voting issue for you here today, and a voting issue is a main point of clash in the round. Our one voting issue is the effect it has on people. Starting off with an argument from our opponents, again, they say just turn it off, but again, this is an obsession, and this rise in true crime is becoming an obsession here in America. Most people are unknowingly paranoid, as we said before, because they're unknowingly paranoid, the stress level is getting too high, and their quality of life is going down. Moving on to another thing that our opponents argued, which was that true crime podcasts make people careful. But there's a difference between being careful and being paranoid, and what these true crime podcasts are doing is making people inappropriately paranoid. Another argument from the opposition was that people can relax while listening to true crime podcasts. But this is exactly the problem. Because these podcasts and their accessibility, horrific crime is being normalized to the point where people can just relax and listening to someone being violently mutilated while going to sleep. Our opponents say that they can have sympathy for the victims while listening, but although this is true, it's good to have sympathy, what's going to stand out is not the sympathy they are getting, but the disgusting comments justifying their attacker's behavior and the money being made off of their pain. Lastly, our opponents argue that the true crime podcasts are an accessible way for many to make money, but this is again perpetuating the problem of exploitation that we've already seen in the true crime industry. And with that, I would a strong vote in the affirmation.